Hey guys, so unfortunately I recorded the entirety of the video, I think yesterday, and the sound didn't work because bad things happen to good people. So I'm gonna re-record it now, and we'll be a little bit behind, but that's okay. So we are talking about some alternatives to industrial farming methods, okay? So industrial farming is pretty basic. You just do what is called a monocrop, which is where you just plant one type of thing in a field, and you use machines to plant, to fertilize, to harvest, to till, all that, okay? You can see on the left here, this is an example of industrialized agriculture, where they have planted a monocrop. Now, it's kind of strange to me I don't know, it's a weird distinction because honestly, industrial ag is so pervasive that it is now just normal agriculture. It is not competitive to not do industrial ag. So I don't know, and even if you want to think about like the practices that people are using here, if you scale them down, these women are using the exact same practices. They're not just hand to mouth farming anymore. They're still using modern and technological practices to get the food that they need and to sell the food that they need. So I just need to make sure that, when we say industrial ag, we're kind of just talking about normal modern ag. Today I want to talk, though, about some alternatives to this, like, mass farming. So the first that I want to go into is called shifting ag. A lot of times this is called slash and burn. And you can see an example here in the picture of why it's called slash and burn. Basically, places that this is pretty popular are developing, so like third world is what they used to be called. Now we call them developing countries. So developing countries that don't have a lot of infrastructure and don't have a lot of industrialization, places that live in very, very nutrient poor soil, so like the tropics, the rainforests, the jungles, things like that, where the soil, as soon as something dies and gets into the soil, it is sucked back up by all the plant life there. So the soil itself is really poor, or it's really warm, which means that there's lots of things growing, so there's just not a lot of empty space. So essentially what slash and burn will do is they will, rope out an area that they want to turn into, cropland, and they will burn everything in that area. And what this will do is, like, all of the biomass that was sitting on top of that land, all of the nutrients, all of the minerals, all of the biomass itself will, burn and return down into the soil, and that will fertilize the soil. Then people will plant on it or graze on it or do whatever they need to do on this land, and then once the land is exhausted, they will then move to new land. So they shift from one section to another. There's obviously a lot that's wrong with this, but I want to talk first about the benefits to doing this. So again, it's done in places that they don't have a lot of machinery or they don't have a lot of space. And it is a pretty decent way to turn unusable soil into something workable or arable. There's not a whole lot of other options when you get in these tropical places. Like, you have to enrich the soil in some way. And if you don't have the infrastructure or the money to do it the appropriate way, this is a good way to do it, okay? However, there are obviously a lot of bad things about doing ag this way. And we need to make sure that we know how slash and burn can cause environmental damage. So first of all, just deforestation. Anytime that you cut down a tree or burn down a tree, you are removing the ability to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. So you're going to increase your net carbon in the atmosphere because you've taken away the plants, and the plants are the only thing that can take it out of the air. You also are burning, so you have CO2 emission from the burning. You have erosion because the soil is now exposed to wind and heat and light that it's not used to, because again, this is done in very tropical places that have a very, very big tree and then understory kind of situation going on, where, soil's used to having these big trees that cover it from the sun and the wind and the rain. If you remove all of that now, this soil is going to become very movable, and it's going to lead to desertification, which is where you take a usable piece of land and it turns into a desert. Okay. You're also forcing the area to move into secondary succession. So if you remember back in Unit 2, we talked about the different kinds of succession. You've got primary succession, which is basically how do you go from barren rock into like a forest again. And secondary succession is not quite as bad. You have soil present, which means that it's a little easier for things to get started. However, it is going to be very difficult, and you're going to have a reduction in the biodiversity of the area because, again, if we're talking about jungles, you have trees, and then everything else that lives in that area likes to be in the shade. So until you get some trees that can create shade, everything that lives there is going to have to be okay with growing in direct sunlight, again, usually in a very warm, sunny climate. So it's going to take a really long time for this area to go back to being normal. Okay. However, there are some techniques, and we'll talk about them later, that we take from shifting ag that you can apply in more, environmentally friendly ways that make it not quite so environmentally destructive, but there are usable things that can come from it. Sometimes the people will do this with animals, so they will just like rope off an area and turn their animal loose, and the animal just kind of eats everything that's in that area. Again, that's still, slash and burn because, what you're left with in the end looks identical, even if you didn't burn it. If you're doing animals on the land this way, you're going to get overgrazing, and you're going to get soil compaction, which is where their big fat animal feet push down on the soil and it compresses and gets rid of all that pore space, and so you don't have as much drainage, and so the soil kind of saturates, and in the bottom it kind of kills the soil. So we need to make sure that we know that desertification is where you take arable, usable land and turn it into desert. And we need to be aware that overgrazing causes a loss of vegetation, it causes erosion, and it can result in desertification as well. And we saw a lot of this out in kind of both of this out in the western U.S. with the Dust Bowl. So they started grazing their animals on the land and, kind of overgrazing, and that contributed to the Dust Bowl as well as the mismanagement of the croplands. Okay, so our next alternative to more modern, more sustainable agriculture is called nomadic grazing. This is very rarely practiced anymore because it's the whole shepherd and the sheep, cowboy and the cow situation, and it's just really not feasible, especially in America. We have way too many people that live here to make this even a thing that we can do. There's just too much population to support, or the amount of animals it would take to support the population. There's not enough land to have those animals roam around. However, we do have a more modern approach, which is called rotational grazing, where you will pin the animals in, but you will move them from space to space depending on the season. So you can see that a lot here in Prairie Grove. I used to have a farm back behind my house when I lived here, and there were two big fields. And so in the spring, the cows would be in this field, and in the summer, they'd be over here. Or in the fall, they'd be over here. So while the cows are in one field, the other field has a chance to regenerate, and then they will shift it back. So it's kind of like you're going into new areas, even though you're not. So it's kind of an idea that comes from this nomadic grazing. So we're going to move into sustainable agriculture now. These are practices that are overall attempting to conserve the soil. The goal here, you want to make sure that every year you can go back to the same area and farm, and that you never use the area up and you never render the area useless. Okay, so there are 6 practices that you can employ to kind of try and conserve the soil in the area, and these can be interspersed with monocropping. These can be integrated in with monocropping, but every single one of these has a pro and has a con to it, so we're going to talk about those now. We're going to get through a couple, maybe 1 or 2 of these, and then we'll have to cut it and go to the next video because I'm very long-winded and I'm sorry about it. So the first type of sustainable ag practice that I want to talk about is called contour plowing. Typically, whenever you see a field that has been plowed, it's usually always in a straight line. That's like why when you go out to like Kansas and you look in the corn fields, it's all just like rows, and it kind of is mesmerizing and sickening. That's a pretty common practice because it's really easy to just run your tractor up and down those straight lines. However, if the wind blows, if it rains, you're going to get erosion because nature doesn't work in straight lines. Okay, so contour plowing is an attempt to address the issue of soil erosion, where you plow with the lay of the land. So you use the natural topography of the land and you plow around that. So like if this was all straight lines, the wind and the water would eventually blow or drain the soil to looking like this. So why not we just start out like that? That way, whenever there's a good wind or whenever it rains, you're not going to get a lot of erosion because the soil's already sitting in a place that it would have settled down into. Where you're reducing erosion. So some of the good things about contour plowing, I mean, obviously you reduce erosion. However, some of the bad things about contour plowing is it's kind of a pain in the butt to deal with. You can't just like sit on the tractor and forget what you're doing. You got to pay attention. You're not getting 100% of the land used. You can see that there's like empty spaces in here where it was maybe too steep, or something was going on and they couldn't farm right there. So it's not as efficient, but in the long run, it's more efficient, if that makes sense. Okay, let me get through intercropping and we'll be done. So the next type of ag I want to talk about is called intercropping. You can see a picture of it here. It is where you plant 2 or more species in the same field. Okay, so in this picture here, you can see we've got corn and we've got beans. That's a very common pairing, corn and beans, because intercropping promotes nutrient synergy within the field itself. So every type of plant takes a different thing from the soil. Corn specifically is extremely nitrogen hungry. It takes a lot of nitrogen in the soil to make a corn plant grow. So what that means is that when you are done farming corn in a field, you have to rehabilitate the soil because the corn has pulled almost all of the nitrogen out of it and nothing new can grow. However, if you plant beans in between, beans are nitrogen fixers, which means that they will take nitrogen out of the air and put it back in the soil. So by planting them in the same field together, often at the same time, you will get corn pulling nitrogen from the soil, and the beans are putting it right back in as often as the corn is pulling it out. So you can just turn right back around the next season and replant in this field. You don't have to take time off rehabilitating the soil. So that's probably your biggest pro here, is you get that nutrient synergy. You also get a lot of wind breaks for this low-lying soil. So you can see a lot of exposed soil in this bean crop right here. If the wind blows or if it rains real good, that soil is going to be very movable. However, over here, it's going to be hard for the wind to penetrate the dense middle vegetative layer. So you don't get a lot of wind erosion with taller plants like this. So these tall plants are going to provide a wind buffer. So you're not going to get as much erosion with these smaller guys. You're also going to get a decrease in the pest presence of the area because, like, if you get a bug that likes to eat corn, it's only going to be able to eat the corn here. It's not really going to go into these border areas because that's beans and the bug doesn't care about that. So overall, your pest control is better because you are not giving it unlimited food to grow and eat. A lot of times it's called strip cropping, and you can kind of see why, because it's in strips. Another kind of variation of this, I like to call it diet intercropping, is called crop rotation, where instead of planting things in the same field at the same time, you will plant them alternate by the year. So like if we planted corn here one year, next year we'll plant beans, and that helps to reduce the soil exhaustion. So again, you're rehabilitating that soil from all the nutrients that got pulled and are now in that corn that you sold. Also, it can help reduce the pest presence because like any eggs or anything like that that remained in the soil is not going to be able to establish the next year because if it's a corn bug, it's going to wake up in the spring and find beans there, and there's not a whole lot that a corn bug can do about that. So, okay, we will pick back up tomorrow and start talking about agroforestry. So I will see you guys then. Bye.